Alrighty, so now that we got the internals of Gulp down, and we know the terminology, and we can identify potential issues when certain errors happen, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the common Gulp plugins that we'll be using, some of the things that make Gulp amazing. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go through every single Gulp plugin that's in use, but know if it has to do with transforming files, it's probably there sitting on an NPM somewhere for you with great documentation and community support. So again, documentation is your friend. But in this video, I want to go through the common ones, the things you're going to be using all the time if you want to do any sort of JavaScript or CSS transformation. Now, of course, Gulp is not restricted to doing things like transforming CSS or transforming JS. Gulp can do whatever you want it to. It could zip up your project. It could publish it to a website. It can transform your HTML files. It can, if you're writing Angular, it can take all of your Angular templates and stick them in a single file for fast loading. It can optimize images. It can do it's just a task runner. If there's a plugin for it, it can do it. And there's a plugin for pretty much everything. But in this video, we're going to be talking about some very specific plugins that are pretty ubiquitous in the Gulp ecosystem. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is I want to add source maps. So if you were not here and did not watch the ES 2015 section of the series, source map is basically a way for the browser to know with compiled JavaScript code where in the source JavaScript code or CSS or less or Sass or whatever that line came from. So it's great for error reporting during debugging, during development, so that you can know that, for example, if there was an error on line 10 on the code that the browser actually executed, that it's actually happens to be in the source on line 5. So they're very, very important, very powerful. Now, not surprisingly, Gulp, a Gulp plugin has great support of source maps. So let's hop over to NPM and look at Gulp source maps. So Gulp source maps is a plugin for Gulp that other plugins have to hook into. So because this is so ubiquitous, practically every plugin that does some sort of transformation that transpiles anything will plug in to Gulp source maps. I mean, look at this. It's been downloaded 36,000 times today. So how do we use it? Now, fortunately, things like Babel and Less might have options to generate source maps, but generally it's preferable to use a more consistent syntax, a consistent API. And that's what Gulp source maps gives us. So let's go ahead and download it. I'm going to go ahead and say Gulp install Gulp source maps save dev. So the save dev is important. Oh, Gulp install. Wow. I've just been saying Gulp way too many times. I just need npm install. That's what I meant. You didn't see that. All right. So we have Gulp source maps installed. How do we use it? Well, the first thing we do is we import it. So we're going to say source maps equals require Gulp source maps. And then to use it, basically, whenever we pipe over into something that transforms our stream, we want to wrap this in 2 calls to source maps. So let's start off with our dev scripts in Babel. Immediately after we start our stream by gathering all of these files, these JavaScript files, I'm going to pipe it into source maps.init. And then you can go ahead and run as many plugins as you want. And when you're done piping to other plugins that might transform these JavaScript files, then pipe it into source maps.write. In this case, I'm going to provide a period here. And that just specifies to render out your external source maps. So let's go ahead and run that. Let's go ahead and say Gulp dev :scripts. Remember, the function's called dev scripts, but I registered it as dev :scripts. Let's jump into public scripts. And what we can see here is our source maps URL being set to utility.js.map, which doesn't look like Node picked up on. And there it is. So this is doing external source maps. So this tells the browser where to download the source map from. And if I click on this map, here's the map. Same here. So now if I were to run this in a browser and I had an error, I would get that information. Let's go ahead and just do that real fast. I'm going to go ahead and do index.html, doc type HTML, HTML head plus body. And don't care about really any of this other than I'm going to do script source, and I'm going to do / scripts application.js. All right. And then I'm going to open up a new command window. So I'm going to say start CMD. And I'm going to jump into public and run my HTTP server. With that running, I can now go to localhost 8080. And I see my awesome blank HTML document here. With an error for the favicon, of course, because I don't have a favicon. Let's go ahead and jump into our scripts application.js and cause a problem. Let's say console log blah, 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 which is not a variable that exists. Then let's hop over into our command window and say gulp dev scripts. That'll compile that error into our code. Now we can come back to Chrome, hit refresh, and notice how it says uncaught reference error, blah, 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 blah is not defined, but it says application.js line 10. Which is right there. So as you see right here, well, no. Our Chrome window is freaking out right now. But still, the point is, at the very least, it got the console log right. And so it looks like we have something cached somewhere. But that's okay. I'm not too concerned about this. The point is, though, is our source maps are being loaded, even if it kind of freaked out right here and decided to truncate our file. So anyway, let's go ahead and add source maps to our less. Now, not surprisingly, it's very easy. Coming here to dev styles, after we do our .source, we will pipe it into source maps.init. After we pipe it into less, we will pipe it into source maps.write. In this case, this will work with inline source maps, so I don't have to specify a file or a directory to put the source maps into, and they'll be written inline. So now I can say dev, or gulp dev styles. Come back here to styles, site CSS, and check that out. It dumped our source map right there. So now we have source maps for our site CSS. I can prove that by going into index.html, adding in a .header, whoa, and including in link rel equals style sheet, href equals styles site CSS. And it decided to make that a div, but that's okay. We won't judge Visual Studio Code. Come back here, hit refresh, and if I right-click inspect, notice how it's saying that it located this rule from header.less. Even though we're not using header.less, we're using site.css. All right, so that's source maps. Very straightforward. You're going to use this basically for anything that supports source maps, and it'll be awesome. So let's talk about another one. Let's talk about auto prefixer. I love auto prefixer. Auto prefixer is fun. So auto prefixer is basically something that will find, you guys know how in CSS, certain versions of certain browsers for experimental features that haven't been standardized use a prefix like -moz or -webkit or -ms. Well, auto prefixer will automatically detect when you're using something that has prefixes and insert those prefixes for you. So let's see how it works. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say npm install gulp auto prefixer save dev. Come back here into our gulp file, load this guy up. And now I have auto prefixer. And so to use it, I'm going to come down here to my dev styles. After I transform less, now this is important because we don't want the auto prefixer dealing with less code. We want to deal with CSS code. I'm going to say pipe, pass it into auto prefixer, and then for my options, I'm going to pass in browsers. And you can check the documentation for what to put in here, but basically you're saying how much compatibility are you looking for? Because as you know, once a feature gets really standardized, browser vendors will remove the prefixes. I'll just say last two versions. So now that we have that going, let's go into our site.less and add something in here that will require prefixes for certain things, like display flex. And then maybe within container we'll have a child, and we'll do a flex. Let's do flex basis, and set that to 100px or 100px, whatever, it doesn't matter. And let's go ahead and run our gulp dev styles. And then let's jump into our public styles site CSS and check that out. That's not how you spell flex, by the way. If you learn anything in this series, just know that the E comes after the L. Okay, there we go. So now we have two instances of where auto-prefixer went in and made this code compatible with browsers that don't that require a prefix. And notice that the source maps still work, which is really awesome. So yeah, that's another really common one. How about one of my favorite Gulp Gulp plugins? Now the cool thing about this plugin that I'm going to show you guys is that it's actually going to change how most of this file is written. And the plugin's called Gulp Load Plugins. I use this guy all the time. I'm just going to show it to you guys, and I'll just change the code up a little bit. And the first thing we need to do, of course, is npm install it. So npm install Gulp Load Plugins, save dev. I think you guys really like this. This is one of my favorites. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and, how about just delete all these dependencies. And then I'm going to say money equals require gulp-load plugins. And then I'm going to immediately execute it. Right? So I'm loading in gulp load plugins, and then I'm immediately executing it. And now we have a problem. So all of the plugins we've been using are now not available because we removed all of those dependencies. Check this out. Instead of source maps, it's now money source maps. Instead of less, it's now money less. That actually sounds kind of funny. Instead of auto prefixer, it's money auto prefixer. Same with source maps. So money source maps, money babel, money source maps, and we're good. And now I can come in here and I can say gulp default, and our code's gonna work, hopefully. I always hate saying that like before I see it working, because then it blows up and I can't pretend that I knew that was gonna happen. But anyway, so what does it do? Well, you kind of get an idea of it. Basically, gulp load plugins looks in your package.json, finds every single dependency that starts with gulp dash, and then when you execute it, what it'll do is it'll load all of those modules that start with gulp dash, and it'll return it into an object. Whatever you want to specify. I mean, some people do plug if they want to, or p. I like using the money symbol personally for my gulp load plugins, but you can use whatever you want. And now I can access all my plugins by just using their name minus the gulp dash. Now before we could have done something like blah 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 equals require gulp source maps. And then we could use this variable to reference gulp source maps. But now we're required to now use the name of the actual plugin. So again, the thing that we're going to use is the plugin minus the gulp dash. And that's it. Yeah, it really cleans up your code. I really hate seeing a gulp file with like 10 million lines of requires, and that really helps out. Alrighty, so in the next video, what we're going to be doing is looking at some potential production builds. So we see how we can, kind of in development, have all this stuff going on, but in production we have different constraints. And we'll talk about that in the next video and how we can use Gulp to do that for us. And we'll see you guys then.